Welcome to Independent Truths with Scott Atlas, my new show that brings a uniquely rational perspective to the important issues facing our society today. And today it's a great pleasure to host Heather McDonald, one of our nation's most important voices in exposing truth, the necessary truths that are the foundation of any discussion about American society. Heather McDonald is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She's a contributing editor of City Journal and a New York Times bestselling author. She is a recipient of many prizes and awards for her writing on a range of topics, including higher education, policing and criminal justice reform, immigration, and race relations. Heather's newest book is called When Race Trumps Merit. Just been released. We have an important, a really necessary conversation about what we are witnessing in the United States, an unprecedented repudiation of the enforcement of law, of merit-based achievement, and the fundamental history of this country, and hopefully a little bit about where do we go from here if we want to succeed as a free, prosperous, and what I think must be said, an ethical society. Thanks for joining us and stay tuned. Welcome to Independent Truths with Scott Atlas. Today's guest is Heather McDonald, one of our country's most important voices exposing truth and, hate to say it, but the importance of truth in any discussion about America's society today. Heather is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal, a New York Times bestselling author. She is a recipient of the 2005 Bradley Prize, the 2022 Jean Kirkpatrick Prize for Academic Freedom.
Yay, so are you.
From Encounter Books. We shared a stage.
That's great.
And Heather has won many other awards and prizes for writing on a range of really the most controversial topics of all: higher education, immigration, police and police reform, race in America. Her writing has appeared in every major newspaper and publication, and her newest book is just out, When Race Trumps Merit, just been released. And in that book, she explains, in her own words, quote, "The foolish pursuit of undermining meritocracy in favor of equal outcome is sacrificing excellence, destroying beauty, and threatening lives," unquote. To finish up the intro, Heather holds a BA in English from Yale, an MA in English from Cambridge University, and a JD from Stanford University Law School. Welcome, Heather.
Great to be with you again, Scott. I wish we were in person, but this is the second best, so thank you.
This isn't so bad. Yeah. Yes, thanks really for doing this. There's so many things to talk about. It's almost hard to know where to begin, so we're going to begin with your new book, When Race Trumps Merit. And in that book, I think you explain first the basis of what we are seeing today, which really has to be a historic cultural revolution in the United States. And the basis of that is something that you call, and that has been called, quote, disparate impact. For our listeners, explain what that is and give us the brief history of that.
Well, let me start with a concrete example, Scott. For decades, blacks have been suing police departments and fire departments, claiming that those departments discriminate against black applicants in screening for firefighting or for police jobs. And the only evidence that is ever presented in these discrimination lawsuits is the fact that blacks fail the entrance exam at higher rates than whites. They're not claiming that there's actual intentional discrimination going on. It's just that an entrance exam that asks for, let's say, a 9th grade level of literacy for a firefighter or a police officer, so that firefighter can read the instructions on how not to mix chemicals in a disastrous way in fighting a fire, or asks of a police officer that he can read and understand the patrol guide. If blacks fail those minimal tests of literacy and maybe mathematical skill, that's a racist test, because it is said to have a disparate impact on blacks. And the solution to these lawsuits, which are almost inevitably successful, is to simply throw out the test. We conclude that it's a racist test, and we will lower our standards in order not to have any kind of disparate impact on black applicants. And that idea that if blacks fail a meritocratic standard at higher rates, that meritocratic standard is by definition racist without any further evidence of, the usual fictional idea that the SATs say ask about regattas. Those types of questions never existed, but if they had, they've been purged for decades. You don't have to show actual discrimination in the test, merely the impact itself. And that idea started within the law. Court decisions said, okay, we can no longer find much intentional discrimination among employers in the United States, but we still want to have a whole lot of discrimination lawsuits going on. So we're going to now say that if an employer has a test for employment that has a disparate impact on blacks, it's a racist test. That idea has now spread across the cultural landscape. As you've seen, Scott, it's tearing down meritocratic standards in science, in medicine, in law enforcement, and even most astoundingly and tragically in the arts.
And even frighteningly, that kind of disparate impact is true now for all interview processes. Every result, every asymmetry
Yes.
in a career position or any job is termed must be on the basis of racial discrimination. I'm a frequent flyer, and particularly on one airline, United Airlines. And I was called up because I'm such a frequent flyer into the cockpit by a couple of the pilots,
wow.
and we were talking.
Huh.
And the pilot said, I ought to be very concerned about the training program for pilots because there is this overt intent. Again, nothing to do with merit on the basis of outcome, a percent of people. And, we always hear this sort of thing about the reality of such a determination in pilots, in brain surgeons is the classic example. Don't we care about competence anymore? I mean, this is frightening. And I just think it's hard to explain on the basis of simply being a rational person.
We are apparently either sleepwalking or so cowed by the phony racism charge that we are willing to put scientific progress at risk, to put lives at risk, whether it's through massively lowering standards to qualify as a doctor or getting rid of law enforcement, prosecution, policing, because that has a disparate impact on black criminals, not because the criminal justice system is racist. We're so cowed by those charges, or we're simply, fat and lazy and indifferent and want to turn our eyes away from the consequences of these decisions. But Scott, as you say, it is absolutely true. It is impossible to find a corner of American experience, American effort, American institutions that is not being torn down by the phony racism charge. As long as racism remains the only allowable explanation for any racial disparities in any institution, it is all coming down. I cannot stress this enough. Everything you have relied upon for security, for safety, for being able to have competent doctors or accountants or lawyers, it is all coming down because of this disparate impact concept. And we have to arm ourselves with the facts and provide the real explanation for why we do not have proportional representation across our institutions.
Right, which is, of course, a very complicated question to answer. And this might be part of the attraction of this theory, is that it's such a simple explanation that everything else is ignored. And the solution is very simple. Simply adjust the percentage of people if you believe in this fallacy. I mean, the irony of all ironies to me, and I've had these discussions with people like Glenn Lowry recently and others, the irony is this society has done so much for changing the discrepancies, the discrimination that clearly existed in the past. And it's fact that, as you point out, this is now a standard part of all walks of our society, all institutions, to promote and accommodate minorities in a preferential fashion. And we've been doing this for more than half a century. And whether, you have to wonder, it's not just ironic, but is that also pointing out the failure of those preferential policies, that this is still not enough?
Preferential policies are poison, if I can use an alliteration there. They cause further racial gaps. They cause further division. They are an absolute burden on their alleged beneficiaries. It is not, you're not doing anybody any favors by admitting them to an institution under lower standards than your peers. And let's take this out of the race context for a moment, Scott, and put it into the sex context. If MIT decided to admit me because it wanted more sex parity or gender parity in its student body, something that I think is completely irrelevant and should never be a goal of a university, and I had 650s on my math SATs on an 800-point scale, and I was being admitted under lower preferences, and my peers who were admitted on a sex-blind basis had 800s, near, a perfect score or close to it on their math SATs, I would flounder in my first year of school at MIT. I would likely flunk out of my calculus class because that class would legitimately be pitched at the average level of my peers. And the diversity bureaucracy would step up and say, oh, let us tell you why you're feeling out of place academically here. It's because you are existing in a patriarchal, misogynist environment of rape culture, and you're being discriminated against. I would not be told the truth, which is that I had been admitted under a very lower standard of admission. That is true for the so-called beneficiaries of race preferences as well. Blacks and Hispanics are almost the only group that are systematically put at such a massive disadvantage by being catapulted into academic environments for which they are not competitively qualified. I am not saying that blacks should not go to college. To the contrary, yes, they should, but they should go to college on the same criteria as everybody else, with students with which they share their academic credentials. Now, if I can just get back to some of your other points here, you said, well, it's a complicated question to answer why we have these disparities and why a colorblind meritocratic standard doesn't produce a Alzheimer's research lab that is 13% Black neurologists, which is the population at large in the United States of U.S., or a cancer research lab that is 13% Black oncologists, or a law firm partner group that is 13% Black partners. It's actually very simple why we don't have those racial proportions, Scott. It is the academic skills gap. Given the extent of that gap, you can have diversity or you can have meritocracy. You cannot have both. And we are deciding as a culture, because we are so terrified of the fact that the skills gap is not closed for decades, despite efforts that are nonstop by both government and philanthropists to close it, that we're saying the only allowable explanation must be racism, and Americans turn their eyes away from the great academic disparities, the crime disparities. They don't want to hear them. But if I could just put one example of that out for your viewers, Scott, 66% of Black 12th graders do not possess even partial mastery of basic 12th grade math skills, defined as being able to do arithmetic or read a graph. 66% are not even partially competent in those skills. The number of Black 12th graders who are proficient in 12th grade math, and that's defined as being able to calculate with ratios, is 6%. And the number who were advanced in 12th grade math is too small to show up statistically in a national sample. Now, those skills gaps never close. They show up again on the SATs, the LSATs, the MCATs, the GREs, the GMATs, and they mean that you cannot have proportional representation in meritocratic institutions without massively lowering standards.
Right. I mean, the evidence is very sort of straightforward, as you're pointing out. The explanation, what I meant by complicated is the solution to these differences.
Right.
And that's quite complicated because I just wonder historically, and I don't know if you have the data on this, you probably do if anyone does, what is that number of proficiency, what has happened to that number over decades? I wonder if that's been lowering or has that been unchanged for decades in the proficiency of certain student groups by race or other on math and science. This sort of goes to the so-called, hate to use a Kamala Harris phrase, but root cause of things. You wonder what's happened since, the 60s, when I was a little kid in Chicago, and you look at the videos of families going out or going to the baseball game or whatever.
Yeah.
And even though things were very difficult for minorities then and discrimination was widespread, there was a family unit, I think. There was a pride in your family. I just wonder, the breakdown of a lot of different things has happened. I wonder what's happened in the proficiency in school of young children.
Well, I couldn't agree more. It breaks my heart when I see these pictures of bourgeois blacks in the 40s and 50s doing everything they can to live up to America's standards of middle-class behavior. And at that time, America was treating blacks with just unthinkable, heartbreaking cruelty, gratuitous nastiness. You see Ella Fitzgerald and Duke Ellington, dressed to the nines, and they're still being excluded from restaurants and hotels.
Right.
And it's like we're ships passing in the night. And then, amazingly, miraculously, nobody would have predicted it. We really did change society, went from white privilege to what is, frankly, I'm going to be very blunt here, with a universal system of black privilege. Every institution has open arms for blacks, twisting itself into knots to hire and promote as many blacks as possible. And yet now you have a rise of an oppositional culture that does not embrace those bourgeois norms. But as far as academic achievement, I don't think it was hugely better in the 60s. There was a brief time in the 80s when those skills gaps were somewhat narrowing, but then that progress stalled, and it has not gotten any better. And in your field of the just cruel and pathological school shutdowns, we do know that the academic skills gaps have widened post-COVID because of the moving to so-called remote learning, which is a kind of a contradiction in terms, it turns out.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that even if you just take it that the efforts are well intended, Milton Friedman said many things which are important, but one was you should judge a program on the basis of the results and not the intent.
Right.
And there's nothing that to me has been more destructive than some of these extreme, using a term loosely, affirmative action policies that have really undermined the achievements of people from minority groups, particularly, who actually do achieve the standards that are necessary to excel. Because I think many people assume, okay, well, you got in because of affirmative action, you have the job because of affirmative action. It's so detrimental to individual achievement. And of course, individual achievement and the desire for that is the basis for success.
Right.
I mean, there can be no question about that. And what strikes me also, I think you and I are of the same vintage. When we grew up, there was this, extreme admiration for Martin Luther King Jr. because of his aspirational colorblind society. And, not only has that vision disappeared, and no one even talks about Martin Luther King Jr. anymore at all, but his aspiration was that everyone reap the rewards of the United States. It was a given that this was the land of opportunity, and he wanted to extend it, and rightfully so, to everyone. And today, instead, we have a theme that the country and everything it stands for is the problem, and it has to be torn down. No one talks about colorblind society. And what's more worrisome to me than anything, and I've said this before, but we seem to be entering an era of extreme racism. We are, we're in this, what is overtly anti-white racism, a vilification, a demonization of a group that to me brings back the horrendous examples of the demonized populations of Jewish people in World War II. Is that where we're headed? It's a sort of a stark analogy, and I don't mean to speak with hyperbole, but it's very frightening now what's happening.
Well, it's very risky these days to use the Holocaust analogy. You're going to be called out on it, but it is absolutely the case that all you need to do now to take out an individual or an institution is to append the epithet white to that individual or institution. You can see this on a practically daily basis in the New York Times. If the New York Times wants to discredit an institution or an individual, it would just say it's a white institution or, predominantly white. And there's an amazing set of double standards in the coverage of crime. The only time that the press, and it's not just the left-wing press, liberal press, it's even places like the New York Post, the only time that the race of a criminal will ever be given is if that is a white criminal. Otherwise, the race of a criminal is always left out because they are so disproportionately black. And the race of victims will only be given out if they are black with a white perpetrator. Otherwise, the usual configuration in crime, which is black criminal, black victim, or black criminal, white victim, you will never get the race of that. And we're supposed to pretend this. We live, Scott, today by a whole set of fictions. It's just incredible. I mean, we're supposed to go around pretending, along with President Joe Biden claims all the time, that black parents are right to fear that their children will be killed by a cop or a white person every time those children step outside. That's completely insane. Yes, black children are at much higher risk of their lives than white children because black teenagers are going around engaging in these barbaric drive-by shootings. Whites are not killing blacks. Here's the reality. When you look at interracial violence between blacks and whites and blacks commit 87% of all interracial violence. So it is blacks who are a threat to whites, not vice versa. But we live these fictions, and it's not just silent. I say nobody's talking about Martin Luther King's colorblindness, and I see the content of your character, not your skin. It's that if you actually talk about that, you will be accused of committing a micro, if not a macroaggression on blacks. The phrase, if you don't see my color, you don't see me. So it is a explicit repudiation of that. And the reason is that America's elites, as I said before, are terrified that the skills gap has not closed and will not close. And so they are preemptively making sure that the only allowable explanation for that skills gap is racism. And they don't want to move to a colorblind system.
I mean, one of the clear problems here is there's an obvious political nature motivation to this. I mean, when you see, Nancy Pelosi go in African garb and kneel down, I mean, I think it's, it's an insult if I were. It's hard to say if I were an African American and have any credibility or real insight. I realize that, but I'm gonna take that liberty and say I was personally offended by that. Even as a white person, I was offended by this sort of blatant political, posturing. But I think that we all have lost any kind of trust, and a lot of us have lost all respect for politicians. So that's not a change. But what is a change to me is the role of the media here. Because I think, we like to pretend that no one watches TV, no one reads a regular newspaper, it's just social media or internet. But the fact is that the media is extremely powerful, extremely influential, whether we like it or not. And I believe that it's not only censorship, it's simply that there is a loss of truth-seeking in the media. The journalism field has really betrayed the public good because they don't talk about the data. They distort, like you mentioned, they vilify with editorialized statements. And I think you and I are similar in that we really try to have our discussions based on the data. What has been your experience, dealing with the media and how you see it today compared to how it was even as recently as 10, 20 years ago with this?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Back in the 90s, we already saw that many press outlets were basically admitting that they were not going to publish the race of criminal suspects any longer because they were so disproportionately black, and they thought, well, that will just create prejudice in all these, primed to be bigoted white Americans. A censorship that was totally against the public interest, because if there's a criminal suspect out there who, let's say, has not been apprehended, you want the public to know everything about the offender description in order to get him off the streets. But the press was deciding, no, it's much more important to fight the latent bigotry of Americans than try to make sure that, more people are not robbed or carjacked or whatever by people that haven't been picked up. So I would say that the bad faith with regards to the press has been with us for at least since the 1990s, if not the 1980s. The whole discussion of affirmative action and racial preferences. I prefer the term racial preferences to affirmative action because affirmative action can still lead people to think it just means extra outreach or the thumb on the proverbial scale between two otherwise identically qualified applicants. No, that is not what affirmative action means. It means massive racial preferences, massive double standards in admissions criteria. So I think the press has been moving in this direction for a long time. But yes, I mean, you say that I've been published in every major outlet or appeared in every major outlet. Not for a while, I have to say.
Yes, absolutely.
I was asked to come on, the last time I was asked to come on CNN was when my book, The War on Cops, came out, and there'd been a shooting in Dallas of 5 white police officers by a black nationalist that seemed to be right in line with the thesis of my book. And CNN asked me to come on the next day, and then at the last minute they canceled because they simply didn't want anybody that would be on that would rebut this narrative that we're living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings of blacks. And I'm prepared to say that there's no government agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black lives matter than the police. So it has gotten worse. I think, the problem is that the universities keep belching out every year ever more insanely narcissistic, ignorant young people who go on to enter the New York Times newsroom, editorial staff, corporations, and they keep pushing us further to the left.
Yeah, I think this is a key point here is that what I call the ideological takeover of campuses has been going on for decades.
Yes.
I mean, we've seen this, we knew this, we meaning parents, professors, just simply observers of what's happening, and it wasn't viewed as so harmful as it is now realized. I think because now I think we're seeing sort of the end game of this, which is the result. We've had decades of this. I don't know if it's too strong to say the word brainwashing, but we have certainly seen a generation plus of young people come out in their sheltered existence on campus with this victimization and these diatribes of really inane things that instead of being the youth or the youthful sort of revolution or whatever against status quo, this is the product of the status quo people, the people in power, the elites. I wonder, just to touch on something else, which is I always think the pandemic, it's not about the pandemic, it's not about the pandemic management, it's about what was exposed by the pandemic. Right. And I sort of feel this is another example of something that is related to the pandemic that we just went through. That is, we had a society, and we still do, particularly where I live in California, that is still grappling with fear, loss of what I call rational thought. Yeah. It's a shockingly passive population, particularly here. There's nowhere more passive other than China and then in California. There's this passive acceptance of arbitrary, pseudoscientific, nonsensical rules, a denial of all data that shows that the rules were wrong and are wrong. And now we have, in my observation, in the November elections of 2022, that of the 9 governors running for re-election, including the mayor of D.C., 8 of them were re-elected, and these were in the 10 worst performing, most stringent lockdown states. People re-elected leaders who destroyed their own families. It's just shocking to me, and I wonder, is this sort of some kind of a sadomasochistic or self-flagellation culture now, where the people, the whites in society, have become sort of intent on destroying themselves? It's a very bizarre, it's sort of a play going on here to me. I don't see any historical precedent to that. Do you?
No, it is absolutely without precedent, and you're absolutely right. We are canceling ourselves as a civilization. The degree of hatred that the leaders of our most important institutions have now directed on the very traditions that it is their privilege to curate and pass on is utterly nauseating. I've never seen anything like it. Whites are a self-canceling group. There's no question about it. They are lying down, saying we are endlessly guilty of everything. No historical knowledge. Now, I've been on a audible sort of reading mission for the last 2 years, Scott, of reacquainting myself with America's civil rights history, Black literature. It is a very tragic past. And I actually do think that sometimes a conservative narrative about America that leaves that out, that it is couched exclusively in terms of, or predominantly in terms of, our commitment to freedom and equality and opportunity, it rubs me the wrong way, and I feel the need to always say, but see blacks. That having been said, though, as rightly uncomfortable we are with our past, it is no worse than any other civilization. No worse, and a lot better.
A lot better.
The type of exclusion and vilification and violence against the so-called marginalized other in every other civilization, and even still today, is far, far worse than what we've got now, whether it's Africa, whether it's China, whether it's the Arab world. Those all were much, much more lethal and totalitarian in their slavery, in their misogyny, in their certainly now in their anti-LGBTQ stance. I mean, you go try and hold a gay pride march in Uganda right now and see how far you get, or Nigeria for that matter. So,
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously the key thing is that, okay, the United States has a past, and we have done more than any other society to reverse that. And I think everybody knows that it's not a coincidence that millions of people want to come to the United States every year, so many that we can't even handle it. I think you bring up something very important, which is given that we're sort of entering this presidential campaign again as an incessant election campaign in the United States, we need a leader who understands that they're actually going to be the leader for everyone, even those who didn't vote for them. And I think we haven't had that for several presidents in a row now, at least 3, where the president didn't understand that you're actually the leader for everyone, not just those who voted you in. And I think this is one of the problems. We have a tremendous lack of leadership in the country because right now we like to talk about policies. We like to talk about sort of specific details of policy, but we are to the point, in my view, where we need moral leadership. We need ethical leadership more than ever. And it's shocking to me that we have gone down this pathway. It's frightening. All of us who have kids are worried about the country we're handing off to people. And that leads me into my sort of last question, and I'm going to have you back because we have so many things to talk about. But, what do, you give a lot of talks, I give a lot of talks on campus, and, what do we tell young people, people coming out of college, people coming out of high school, entering the workforce who understand, because I think everybody with a brain understands that trying hard to do well is the key to doing well. What do we tell them and who are beginning their own families and embarking on careers?
Well, do we want to be honest, or do we want to sort of give them a false sense of opportunity? Because if you're honest and you've got a white son who's heterosexual, it's very hard to tell him honestly that if he puts in an effort, he will be rewarded as he's earned a reward. Because right now, the world is absolutely biased against heterosexual white males. So your sons and grandsons are screwed unless we can get over this insane blaming of meritocratic standards for having a disparate impact. So this is a mystery question to me. And you talk about sort of the need for moral leadership. I'm not a political, have any insight into political strategy. So I don't know if we need a leader that would actually be honest about naming what's hindering American progress right now, which is the racial obsession, or if you take the high road and don't even talk about that and use simple bromides. I don't think it's quite fair to say that. I mean, every president, when he takes office, says, I'm here for all the people. And I'm not quite sure within the context of actual real partisan political divides, how you govern that doesn't have some bias towards one's political worldview.
Of course. But I do. Yeah, I'm just very concerned that I'm not sure I see a resolution of these hugely polarized groups of people in the United States on the horizon. I don't want to be negative. I'm sure you don't want to be negative either, but it's hard to look at what's happening and see a very positive outcome without very, very serious leadership stepping up. And it's going to have to be from all different races, all different skin colors, or all different ethnic groups, or there will be no credibility, I feel.
Well, yeah,
it's very difficult.
I have a view of what needs to be said. I have no idea if that is politically feasible. I believe that the only way that we're going to defeat this phony racism narrative that holds that any racial disparity in any institution is a result of racism, and therefore the institutional standards must be torn down, I believe that the only way to actually drive a stake through the heart of the left's narrative is to give the facts as to why those disparities exist, whether it's the academic skills gap or the massive criminal offending gap. Because otherwise, without that, the left wins. If you can't talk about behavior, if you can't talk about culture, it sure as hell looks feasible that maybe we are a systemically racist society because there are ongoing racial disparities. So the facts are the only thing that helps. I don't know, though, what happens to leaders who get up and tell those facts. I'm often asked to speak to police officers and police chiefs, and they say, well, tell us what we can do to defend our officers. And I say, look at you, police chief, look at you, sheriff. You are letting your police officers or your deputies twist in the wind of this phony racism charge because they will have a disparate impact on black criminals if they enforce the law. Here's what you have to do. You have to get up in every press conference and give the data about criminal victimization, which happens overwhelmingly to blacks, and criminal offending, which sadly, again, nobody wants to hear this, is committed overwhelmingly disproportionately by blacks. You have to get those facts out there, force the press to report them, because if you don't, we're still going to assume that because we have criminal disparities in our prison population, we've got a racist criminal justice system. But these police chiefs are cowards. So we have a distinction between what needs to be said and what feels politically possible, and I don't know how to bridge it. So that sort of leaves it for you and I, Scott, who are not in the political realm, to do everything we can to get those facts out there, to try and make it politically possible to stand up against the racism narrative.
I couldn't agree more. There is nothing that can be done short of saying the facts over and over again.
Yes.
And, whether facts prevail in the end, I don't know, but I know for sure that facts matter. And without facts, we have no society at all. So we're not looking at a short-term solution. We're not looking at a smooth transition to some kind of a peaceful nirvana society. And we're not even saying that people's opinions shouldn't be stated very clearly, but I like to tell people when I'm talking about how to do public policy, the first part is to know the facts. Only then can you form opinions.
Right.
It doesn't work the other way around.
Right.
But I think we'll have to leave it at there, Heather. Otherwise, I could talk to you all day, and I'm sure you have other things to do. But thank you so much for coming on, and I hope I see you again soon.
Thank you, Scott. If I can just respond quickly to your COVID point. Yes, we are a fearful, safetyist, feminized culture that is willing to say that safety takes priority over risk-taking, entrepreneurialism, and a phony sense of fear, and it is absolutely nauseating. So thank you for fighting back against our COVID lies.
Yes, and I think we have seen your terms. The weakness of American culture is so shocking, given the reputation and the foundation of this country in our previous generations, our parents, our grandparents. It's so stunning to see what's happening. I'm hoping that the young generation, whose so far their contributions have been sort of selfies and TikTok, this kind of stuff. I hope the strong younger generation members step up and assume a position of leadership. And I'm trying to do that with some of the entities that I'm involved with, is to really mentor, network, and inspire young people who are out there. They need to realize this is too important. You can't sit back. You got to step up.
Focus on the males, Scott. It's the males that need to be told you are not toxic. Because if males get completely marginalized and disappeared, which is the effort that's going on in elite culture, civilization ends. Males gave us civilization, and if they get permanently cast aside, everything will crumble.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave it on that warning note, Heather. Good talking to you. Thank you
Scott.
again for being on.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Independent Truths with Scott Atlas. If you want to find out more about today's guest, Heather McDonald, check out her Manhattan Institute webpage and Heather's Twitter account. And don't forget, subscribe to our show on YouTube, as well as Spotify, Apple, Google, and anywhere else you're listening to podcasts right now. I'll see you next time.